So today's guest on the Keen on Yoga podcast is Mick Brown. He wrote an excellent book called The Nirvana Express. You can get it now. I think it's... when was it published, Mick?
It was published last year, but then it's coming out in paperback in September, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so it's not a paperback yet. So
not a paperback yet.
Right, so you're just at the right time to get a good value paperback book that really is a page turner. I loved it. I mean, it's so informative. I don't really know where to start, so I think I'm just going to pass it over to you to start, Mick, and then we'll take it from there. Just give us a little overview of the book, if you would.
Well, first of all, it's really, really nice to be talking to you, and thanks so much for inviting me on. It's very, very kind of you.
Great to see you.
Okay, so the book is really a sort of narrative history of the West's engagement with Indian spirituality and teachings, going back to the mid-19th century. Actually, it goes back earlier than that. But I think a lot of people think, if they think about the West's engagement with Indian spirituality, the first thing they think about is the Beatles, of course, and the Maharishi, and the 1960s, and drugs, and the hippie trail to India. But the story goes much, much further back than that. And what I wanted to do was to sort of chart the history of this. It's not an academic book, actually. It's much more a sort of, somebody described it as a romp. And I guess it is a bit of a romp. But I wanted to, beginning with this rather extraordinary man named Edwin Arnold, who was an Englishman. He was a poet and a journalist. And he wrote a book called The Light of Asia, which was the first poetic telling of the life of the Buddha in English. And that was published in the mid-19th century. So the book sort of begins with Edwin Arnold and the chair in the British Buddhist Society, which is the chair that Edwin Arnold was sitting in when he wrote that book. And it follows a sort of a bit of a paper trail, if that's the right word, about these different people who, first of all, people who read Edwin Arnold, then people they knew, and people they knew, and people they knew, and it follows this path through over the century or so, and culminates in Rajneesh, who I'm not sure he ever did read The Light of Asia, but I thought he was a very good place to finish. And in a way, it's sort of it's a lot about gurus, obviously, and about swamis, and about the teachings coming to the West. And I think in a way, Rajneesh was probably the last significant Indian teacher in the West, although I'm sure there are people who would dispute this vehemently and say, no, you haven't dealt with this person or that person.
Oh, yeah. As soon as you put a list together, you're in trouble. So break you off there, because I want to go through kind of like chapter by chapter briefly. Yeah. I thought to do that. So Edwin Arnold, he does seem to mark some of our earliest, or at least on British ground, our earliest contact, outside people, scholars in India, English colonialists doing work, the early English contact with the Orient and with kind of like the other ideas, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. And I think the 19th century was an age of great sort of ferment and an age of great questioning, a lot of questioning about biblical teachings, about Christianity. And not least through the colonization of India, a lot of Indian, Hindu, for want of a better word, spiritual ideas coming to the West. Edwin Arnold had actually been a school teacher in Pune. And he was an extraordinary man. He was one of these great Victorian polymaths who could speak any number of languages, learn Sanskrit and so forth. So at the time that he was writing this, there was this growing interest in Eastern teachings. And two things that were quite significant, I think, quite interesting, is that in 1897, there was actually an Indian yogi called Bhava Lakman Das, who came to England, and he performed, and then that's the word, at the place called the Westminster Aquarium, basically demonstrating different yoga positions, and a periodical of the time described them as being, it's called The Strand, talked of these positions as being a symptom of the repulsive Indian religion. which I think gives you an idea of what the popular idea was of yoga and of Indian philosophy.
But I think that must be one of the first yoga demonstrations ever done in the West, I would say.
I couldn't find an earlier one.
1897. Yeah.
Well, at that time, if you look back at some of the English periodicals in India, of which there were a number, and journalists, a lot of military men who were there, writing for those, describing yogis and yogic practices that they would come across in their travels through the country, in villages and towns and so forth. And again, with this mixture of sort of bemusement, incredulity, sometimes a very serious interest, sometimes with a slightly ironic take on it. But the other big event, really, that brought India to the West, for want of a better word, was the World Parliament of Religions, which happened in 1893 in Chicago, and Vivekananda came and spoke there, and in parlance of today, but certainly not in the 19th century, he basically wowed the audience. He was the hit of the whole Parliament, particularly with women. And there are accounts of women sort of flocking around him after he'd spoken, and I think this is a kind of subtext as well of what happened with yogis and spiritual teachings. You find that particularly in the sort of early 20th century, people like Meher Baba, who we'll come to if you like, their following tended to be largely or mostly women, and women of a certain class, women of a certain disposition, sort of bohemian, and I think they would have seen something kind of romantic in this, and even sexually romantic in a way, but if not perhaps explicitly demonstrated, but something that was rather at odds and variance with perhaps the rather stiff, upper-lipped husbands, merchant bankers, and industrialists who they were married to. And so Meher Baba, who came to Britain in 1931-32, he had a group of such women around him, whom he actually called my lovers, and they weren't literally his lovers, but they would. There are extraordinary accounts of when he came, and he was silent, and so he would communicate with an alphabet board. But when he came, and this group of people around him would sit there, basically in rapture, and there are accounts of them with tears streaming down their eyes, and as if they were in the presence of God. And he didn't altogether disabuse them of the notion that they might be in the presence of God, or at least somebody close to God.
He was always promising to speak again, wasn't he? Meher Baba, I'll speak in a couple of years, and then he never does.
That's right. Oh, he was an important figure, really, in that transmission of the Indian guru to the West. He came to Britain and had a significant following here. He then went to America, traveled to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, and Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks were sort of very enamored of him, and threw a sort of a huge party for him where Hollywood royalty came, and he would sit there and answer questions on his alphabet board. There's a very touching, rather beautiful film which you can find on YouTube about him coming to Hollywood and the speech that he made. He was very enamored of the movies. He loved the movies, particularly a fan, quite logically enough, of silent movies. But he also became very enamored of Greta Garbo, whom he regarded as the most spiritual of all the Hollywood stars. And there's an extraordinary woman who was a lover of Greta Garbo's, called Mercedes D'Acosta. And Mercedes D'Acosta was I hesitate to use the word voracious, but I'll use it nonetheless, lesbian, who said that she could have any woman from any man that she chose, and she was a lover of Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, Paula Negre. There were a lot of people who she was lovers of, and she became very enamored with Meher Baba, and extraordinary correspondence between them, where she she was having this affair with Garbo, and her love was not altogether requited by Garbo. And so she would be asking Meher Baba for sort of advice about how to conduct her love life. And he would sort of talk about that. So you find that you have these extraordinary relationships going on with this rather sort of eccentric group of people, which isn't altogether to do with piety and piousness and religiosity and asceticism, and not always to do with yoga, because not all of these people who followed gurus in those days practiced yoga, which I think is an interesting sort of anomaly, really.
Yeah, I mean, First of all, I hadn't heard of Meher Baba, and when you describe him, he had a huge influence, I think, on the kind of early dissemination of. I mean, what were his ideas? In fact, what were the practices that he gave to people? Do you know?
Well, I mean, this is the point. He didn't really give practices. And because he'd taken a vow of silence, he didn't really say very much. I mean, he would tap out messages to people, but mostly it was just his sort of presence. He seemed to emanate this air of sort of sanctity and holiness, and people were obviously profoundly, deeply moved by this. Pete Townsend of The Who actually became a follower of Meher Baba. Interestingly, after Meher Baba had died.
Oh, really?
And made an album called Who Came First, which is made up of songs written by Pete Townsend, which are influenced by or tribute to Meher Baba. And Tommy, the deaf, dumb and blind kid, that's supposed to be influenced by Meher Baba as well.
Tommy's the musical, if people don't know.
Tommy's the musical, yeah. I'm showing my age here, aren't I?
Yeah. I just assume that everyone knows Tommy, but outside the UK now, well, even inside the UK, unfortunately to say, it may not be the case anymore. Right. What about the Theosophy then? Backpedaling slightly, I wanted to talk about Krishnamurti and Theosophy, and a lot of people don't know about Theosophy, and I think it seems to me that it had a huge, huge influence on really the kind of foundational sowing of the seeds of yoga as a meditational practice and as a kind of attitudinally in the West, but people don't know about it. So that's
absolutely right. Well, Theosophy was the creation of a woman named Madame Blavatsky, who was this extraordinary Russian woman who was sort of adventurous, philosopher, charlatan. She sort of ticks all the boxes, at least as far as my book is concerned. And she was also a sort of spiritualist, and claimed to be in contact with this group of ascended masters who were sort of watching over the world and guiding people. So she founded the Theosophical Society in the late 19th century, along with a man named Colonel Olcott, and that was founded in America, where she'd ended up, and then came to Britain. And part of the whole teaching of Theosophy was the bringing forward of what they call the Maitreya. And the Maitreya is a figure from Tibetan Buddhism. The Maitreya is supposed to be the Buddha to come. And in Tibetan Buddhist teachings, there's no specific date for when this will happen. But Blavatsky taught that this would be happening imminently. And there was a theosopher, a member of the Theosophical Society, called Charles Ledbetter. And he discovered a boy on the beach at Adyar in India, which is where the Theosophical Society had decamped to and made its headquarters. And this was a boy named Jiddu Krishnamurti. And he was a young boy, 9 or 10 years of age. And Ledbetter saw him and professed to discern in him something rather extraordinary, and became convinced that he was the Maitreya to come, and that he needed to be sort of taken under the wing and taught and brought forward. So he was effectively taken away from his father, who was an employee of the Theosophical Society in India. And Krishnamurti and his younger brother Nitya, were brought up more or less as sort of young Englishmen. And they eventually came to Britain, and they were kitted out in Savile Row suits and hogskin gloves and stiff collars and ties. And the Theosophical Society grew at an enormous rate around Krishnamurti primarily, and around the idea that he was the Messiah to come. And then he turned against this and made this very strong renunciation, this pronouncement at a huge theosophical gathering.
I think it was an inauguration, wasn't it? Just as he was meant to be kind of given over as the head, he disbanded the society.
Yeah, I mean, he was certainly the figurehead, but he sort of turned around and said, no, you mustn't follow any teachings, you mustn't follow any leaders, you mustn't follow any religion. Truth is a pathless land. That's the sort of, how many words is that? 4 words that sort of basically destroyed the Theosophical Society, because without Krishnamurti as its figurehead, and without this promise of the Maitreya, the great teacher, but it had an enormous influence. And W.B. Yeats was a member of the Theosophical Society. A guy called Alan Bennett, who was the first Englishman to become a Buddhist monk in Ceylon. He was a member of the Theosophical Society. So it had many strands that sort of fed out into society among sort of intellectuals and scientists as well, because it professed to have a kind of. She wrote a book called The Secret Doctrine, which was basically a sort of cosmology of the world, according to the teachings of her masters. It's supposed to be written, not in automatic writing, but supposed to have been received.
Yeah, I mean, letters generally drop down from the ceiling.
Letters drop down, yeah. And that was subsequently disproved that was the case. But by then, it was out of the hat, so to speak, and it had spread, and the teaching spread. And in fact, Krishnamurti, having renounced the Theosophical Society, he then went on as a sort of philosopher and speaker, and was a very powerful, very influential, and much respected figure.
What do you think about Krishnamurti? Was he teaching similar to Theosophy or different?
No, he'd sort of renounced the whole idea of teachers, and basically said, you've got to look to yourself, for the truth. So I suppose it was in a way it was close to what we now know as Advaita teachings, although it was never described in this. So who is the truth? You have to, only you know what is the truth, and you have to look to yourself for the truth through study and meditation and so forth. So he did teach meditation, but he was. There's a very interesting. And this goes back to what I was talking about earlier about the enamoration that women in particular had for these figures. There was a woman named Lady Emily Lutyens, who was the wife of Edwin Lutyens, who was the most famous British architect at the time and almost since then. He designed New Delhi, and he designed the Cenotaph, where the remembrance service is held every year in London, of course. So Emily Lutyens was his wife, and she just fell head over heels for Krishnamurti, and more or less sort of neglected her family, neglected her marriage, followed Krishnamurti everywhere. And when he then said the truth is a pathless land, that was devastating for her as well, because I think her relationship with him was a very complex one. I mean, it was about religious devotion, spiritual devotion, but also about a romantic devotion that could never be fulfilled and could never properly speak its name. And so she was crushed when he renounced that. So that's a kind of sad chapter in the book, really, about Emily Lutyens' enamoration with Krishnamurti.
Yeah. But I think was it a daughter that wrote the biography of Krishnamurti?
Yeah, Mary Lutyens.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah. He seemed like a very fragile character, Krishnamurti, who seemed quite bona fide in his his experiences and his teaching, quite authentic. But
I think so. I think he was a brilliant man. And whatever Charles Ledbetter had sort of intuited about this sort of rather weedy, slack-jawed, vapor-dyed boy on the beach in Adyar, he'd intuited something, and it certainly wasn't that he was going to be the next Messiah, but certainly Krishnamurti turned out to be an extraordinary teacher and a very, very wise teacher. And through the years, he would come every year to Britain, and I once had a conversation with Terence Stamp, the actor, about Krishnamurti. Because Terence Stamp had a great interest in this. He ended up being a follower of, or being very interested in Rajneesh later on. But he came to know Krishnamurti quite well. And Terence Stamp is a very fastidious dresser, and Krishnamurti was a very fastidious dresser. So I was saying to him, you must have had extraordinary conversations with Krishnamurti. You know, what did you learn from Krishna? No, we'd never talk about that. I'd say, lovely suit you're wearing, Krish. And he'd say, oh, Terence, I do like your tie, you know. So that was the kind of level that they operated on. And I think he probably, so he didn't have the sort of I don't want to say he didn't take himself seriously. He obviously took himself very seriously, but I think he had another side to him rather than the grave, wise.
Yeah, he was well known for the Savile suits, wasn't he? And I think he was very well known for cars as well, and just just the general kind of presentation of himself. Yeah.
I think, and again, this isn't to be cynical, but I think he mastered that wonderful trick of liking beautiful things without being attached to them. I'm saying that slightly tongue in cheek because you know how attached was he to his Savile Row suits? I don't know.
What about Aleister Crowley then? I think that's a character who got often generally condemned, but he definitely features in the book in not a completely ridiculous way.
Yeah, I think he was a really, really interesting character. And you know, I mean, at one point he was in the 30s. He was described as the wickedest man in the world.
Yeah. His mother condemned, didn't she?
His mother condemned. It was
always a bad thing.
Not good. In fact, his mother called him the Beast after the Book of Revelation 666. He was very interested in the occult. And he joined an occult group of which W.B. Yeats was also a member, and he was a practitioner of ritual magic, which is basically trying to sort of turn, in his terms, trying to turn the elements of nature to your guidance. I mean, he's often described as a Satanist. I don't think he was I mean, that's such a simplification of people to call him. Other than Anton de who was a Satanist, you know, there are Satanists, but I don't think Aleister. I see him as being more mischievous than evil in a way, and he was clearly very clever. He was also a mountaineer who climbed some of the highest peaks in the world, and so. He came under not under the spell exactly, but there was an extraordinary young man named Alan Bennett who had been a theosophist and had also been a spiritualist, and he joined this occult society. And it was said of Bennett that he was actually the most accomplished practitioner of ritual magic in Britain at that time. And so he taught Aleister Crowley everything that Aleister Crowley knew. And then Bennett, having read The Light of Asia, the Edwin Arnold book that I was referring to earlier, he had a much broader and I think spiritually focused view of these matters. And he went off to, he was a very ill man, and it was thought that for his health that he should go to the Orient. And he went off to what was then Ceylon, and became the first Englishman to become a Buddhist monk there. And in fact, then came back to Britain in 1908 as part of a Buddhist mission. And he was installed in a house in Barnes, where he slept on the floor. Because of his vows, he wasn't allowed to handle money. And he also wasn't allowed to travel behind a horse, which is a rather interesting prohibition. And at that point, I think at least public transport in London was horse-drawn. So it was quite difficult for...
Causes some difficulties.
Yeah,
I think it's my favourite chapter of yours. And in Ceylon, wasn't it, Crowley visits him and then sees him performing yoga? Then isn't Bennett performing some levitation or something? And Crowley's quite disappointed. Or was he disappointed? He was kind of disgusted at Bennett's yoga, I think. Or even though Bennett was levitating when he came to the room or something.
Well, there's this extraordinary story. So Bennett, I mean, he was. I think Crowley was. he was a kind of opportunist, and I don't know how seriously he studied yoga, he studied Buddhism.
He was a good storyteller as well. I think.
He was a good storyteller.
Yeah.
There's a great story. He was in America during the First World War, and it's a famous story he told, where he talked about Zeppelins bombing Addiscombe, and he said, "My which is South London. Zeppelin bombed Addiscombe, where my aunt lives. Unfortunately, they missed." So he was always looking for a sort of punchline in a way.
Well, his dying words was a good punchline, wasn't it? Didn't he say something like, "Sometimes I hate myself"?
Sometimes I hate myself.
Yeah.
Well, he died in a boarding house in Hastings, a heroin addict, and he would have his heroin sent down, I should say, from a chemist in London. But yeah, so when Bennett went to Ceylon, and Bennett was quite a serious practitioner, very serious practitioner, and you have to be serious to become a Buddhist monk. So there was a story about Bennett had rented a house there, and there was a sort of outhouse, anti-house, where he was meditating, and Crowley came in to see him, because they would leave food outside for Bennett to take, so he wouldn't be disturbed. But he hadn't taken the food, and so he opened the door, and Bennett had apparently levitated, and was sort of positioned at a kind of 45-degree angle against the wall. A friend of Crowley sort of retold this story in a slightly more exaggerated form, and talked about Bennett flying around the room like a leaf. But I don't think that's true. This is one of the things that appeals to me. I'm very easily impressed by these stories, but is sort of I always like signs and wonders, in any kind of in any faith or any religion. I'm a sucker for signs and wonders. Tell me about a good wonder or a good mystery, and certainly there's a lot of that in Crowley's life. And a fair bit of that in Bennett's life. Bennett was a brilliant man. I mean, he was an inventor, and claimed to have invented, all sorts of things which never actually came to pass. And died a rather sad death. He was only 51 when he died. He suffered from pneumonia, and he was in a terrible state, and jaundice and all sorts of things. And he came back to England from Burma, where he eventually ended up, and was living in a sort of very modest boarding house in Battersea in South London, and died there at the age of 51. So, but he's an extraordinary man, really extraordinary man.
I think there's so much research that you've done to kind of bring these people to light, and I kind of wonder, just as an interlude, how long did the book take you? I mean, it's so detailed, and so researched, and where did it take you to research it? You must have had to go to a lot of different libraries to find the kind of documentation you were looking for.
Well, I spent a lot of time in the British Library, obviously.
Right.
The Warburg Institute is a fantastic resource for this kind of period. That has Aleister Crowley's notebooks and some of his correspondence, and Alan Bennett's correspondence, such as.
You're actually able to read that.
Yes,
Wow.
You're able to hold Aleister Crowley's notebook, which is
right.
which is interesting.
People said they were scared of it. That workman that went into his house was freaked out by it.
That's right.
Did you get a feeling when you held Crowley's notebook? Did you get a certain kind of shiver
it's
down your spine?
I didn't get a shiver, but I just thought, this is pretty extraordinary, holding Aleister Crowley's notebook.
How was his writing?
It's very neat. Very neat. Yeah, very neat. But then he's talking in the notebook, he's talking about these different sort of yoga postures that he's trying, and breathing techniques and so forth. Okay. And then it kind of runs out of patience, and he starts talking about his Märchenbaum pipes, because he smoked a pipe. So I think, he was a man of somewhat limited patience. The organization, the Occult group that he was in, was called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Rather wonderful name. And there's still sort of, there's still people who are sort of who are part of that, and see Crowley as being a pretty significant figure in that. Although he was subsequently left the group, but it was very interesting time, very interesting period.
I think one thing to take away from the book that I think we kind of all prone to it generationally is to think that, well, we're the first generation to kind of experience these teachings coming over and synthesized in the Western format, and the perils and the pitfalls of that. But I mean, what really strikes me in reading your book is that it happened quite a number of times, and there's this whole kind of sediment of laid down, kind of different eras built up.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, there's definite. I mean, in the book, I divided into two quite distinct sections, and it sort of ends with a man named Paul Brunton, who again was a very influential figure. He wrote a book called A Search in Secret India.
Definitely full of signs and wonders, that one.
That is full of signs and wonders, yeah. No, I'd recommend that to anybody.
Yeah.
And he was really the first person to sort of introduce Meher Baba to the West. And then Ramana Maharshi, who clearly was a really extraordinary man. So the book ends with Brunton and with Brunton's death. And then begins the next sort of major chapter is the Beatles, Timothy Leary, LSD, drugs, and then on to sort of Allen Ginsberg and.
It does become a bit. Definitely changes tone, becomes a bit more racy. I mean, just to finish the first bit, and we'll talk a little bit briefly about the second part.
Yeah.
Well, anything you can say about Ramana Maharshi? I mean, I think, having said you're a man for sucker for signs and wonders, I wouldn't say you're kind of tried to debunk the guru, but you're certainly quite practical around these characters, and treat them fairly and levelly. What do you think about Ramana? I mean, you seem like you had maybe more time for Ramana as a possible kind of enlightened guru, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what you're saying is right. I obviously didn't ever see Ramana Maharshi, so I never met him. So I never sat in front of him. Again, he's somebody who wouldn't necessarily say very much, but clearly he was recognized from quite an early age by all those around him as being an extraordinary person and having an extraordinary presence. Not just a presence. I mean, he would speak and he would give not even give talks really, but I mean, he would sit there on his seat in his ashram, and people would come and they would ask him questions, and he would answer questions. I mean, he lived an absolutely ascetic, simple life. I mean, he didn't have money. He just had a dhoti, dressed in a dhoti. There was a cow in the ashram who he would look after. He would walk up Mountain Aranchala and spend a lot of time in meditation, in silent meditation. There's an incredible story about Somerset Maugham. I don't know how many of your viewers would be familiar with Somerset Maugham, who I think is a really, really interesting character, and wrote a very interesting book actually called The Razor's Edge, which was published before the Second World War, about an American pilot who becomes very disillusioned with materialistic life in America and goes to India in search of a guru. And that's a book well worth reading. I mean, it's written
great book.
So Somerset Maugham went to India, and he travelled extensively through Southeast Asia and Malaysia, as it was then, and writing stories about rubber plantations and rubber planters and the characters he met. But he'd never really displayed any interest whatsoever in sort of religious teachings of the East. But he went to India at a time when I think he was very interested in this, and he was taken to see Ramana Maharshi. And met a rather extraordinary guy called Major Chadwick. There's a lot of majors in this book, for former majors. And Major Chadwick had gone to India and come to Ramana Maharshi's ashram and just stayed there and become a devotee. And so, first of all, when Somerset Maugham arrived, he was introduced to Chadwick, and they had a conversation. And then Maugham felt very faint, and so was taken to Chadwick's room and lay down there. And Ramana Maharshi was called and actually came to Somerset Maugham. And so they had this time together where nothing very much was said. And Ramana Maharshi said something to the effect of, silence is also conversation, silence is also meaningful. And then word of this spread, and the story that was then spun out of this, or the story that came to be told, was that Somerset Maugham had been so overcome to be in the presence of Ramana Maharshi that he had gone into a state of samadhi, and that he had actually sort of gone into a state of enlightenment and passed out. And this spread far and wide, and Somerset Maugham was rather embarrassedly had to explain that no, he was subject to fainting fits, because of a medical condition that he had. But he was very impressed by Ramana Maharshi, and in fact, Ramana Maharshi became the model for the guru in The Razor's Edge, so that is a pretty interesting. Actually, Somerset Maugham wrote a very interesting essay called "The Saint" about his encounter with Ramana Maharshi.
Which get him in trouble in the end when didn't he visit the ashram again, and they were kind of upset, or someone was upset by this presentation.
No, that was Paul Brunton, who then went
Brunton
back.
Was upset.
Brunton,
and then he was he was
sort of more or less disinvited from the ashram. But I think Ramana Maharshi was an extraordinary character, and the ashram is still there, and visitors flock to the ashram. So I think he clearly had a real quality about him, and a very powerful presence. I remember I spent some time in Sai Baba's ashram in Puttaparthi, which, for anybody that hasn't been there, I mean, it's an extraordinary place, and it's almost like looks like Disneyland in a way. Not that there are theme rides, but the buildings are all in this sort of pastels of pink and blue pastels, and they're very grand and opulent buildings, and the temple is very grand and so forth. And there's a sort of museum of Sai Baba, which rather disconcertingly sort of positions him next to Christ in the sort of pantheon of great teachers and so forth. And so that was kind of an interesting experience. But going there, it was like I used to spend quite a lot of time outside the ashram in the cafe that I go to, talking to people who were sort of escaping from this rather sort of intense pressure cooker feeling in there. And there one would hear, extraordinary stories about how Sai Baba had sent them messages, how they'd had signs and wonders, and how he got inside their heads and so forth. And it did occur to me that actually, this is going to sound very sacrilegious, but the best guru is a dead one in a way, because you can't be disappointed in them. And also the Sai Baba ashram, why not just plant a tree? The idea of this extraordinary sort of magisterial grandeur and wealth and display of riches, and it all seems completely counterintuitive to the teachings about simplicity and devotion. But that said, I mean, Sai Baba, what was it? Love all, serve all was his sort of was his aphorism.
And then one of the Hard Rock, the founder of the Hard Rock Cafe, was a devotee, wasn't it? And it's the motto of the Hard Rock originally.
It was, yeah. And there was a big picture of Sai Baba behind the bar in the Hard Rock. Yeah. That's been taken down since then.
Has it?
Yeah, sad to say.
Again, I think that there's what's really comes up is that there's these strands of the synthesis of Eastern understanding in the West have been going on for so long, which inform what we do today,
yes.
And how we approach things today. And you don't even realize how these layers have been laid down. I think before we move on to Osho, I mean, recognizing we've got a certain time window. Osho is the obvious place to go, I think, from Psy. What about a little detour to Leary, Huxley, and maybe Ginsberg and Alan Watts? And what's going on in the 60s in the US with the LSD, and that was quite a fun kind of interlude in your book.
Oh, well, it's a fun time.
I would have liked to have been around.
Exactly. I get nostalgic for that, and I wasn't even there. Well, I think we can't underestimate the role that drugs played in, if you want to call it, the sort of the second, the second coming of sort of Eastern spirituality. Because starting with Aldous Huxley, Leary, I mean, the teaching coming out of that was that LSD, in particular psychedelics, are the sort of the shortcut to the kind of religious experiences that the great sages have talked about and have been taught about for centuries, really. And so I think that had a profound effect. I mean, it's quite interesting to me. If you wanted one particular symbol of this, the human being in San Francisco in the Summer of Love, 1967. The poster for that is an unnamed Indian sadhu, with a sort of painted on sort of third eye, radiating sort of wisdom and enlightenment. So there was definitely this sort of correspondence between them. And Timothy Leary particularly was a party to that, and through LSD, I think, came to see himself as a sort of a teacher. But interestingly, he went to India, traveled through India, inevitably taking lots of LSD, and described Varanasi as something like the longest running hippie festival in the world, which none of the gurus or swamis in Varanasi had quite seen it in those terms. But he didn't. In his books about his life, in his books about India, I can't think that he mentions a single Indian guru or swami that he became particularly attached to, or particularly enamored of, or sat at the feet of, or anything like that. But the guy who did was very much so was Leary's sidekick, who went to India and came back as a
Rupert Alpert Ramdas.
Richard Alpert Ramdas. Yeah. And he went as Richard Alpert and came back as Ramdas. So I think that shows the degree of transformation that he underwent. And again, was a very interesting character, very sincere, very interesting teacher, very committed teacher. So I think, what I don't want to suggest is that the experiences that people who encountered Indian gurus and swamis, that these were in any way sort of inauthentic or short-lived or didn't have an impact. I mean, one of the things that I feel very strongly about the people who I write about, people like Mercedes D'Acosta or Paul Brunson, I think it's rather touching, the sort of the sincerity with which they engage with these ideas, and the fascination and the genuinely deep fascination that they have with these ideas. And clearly many people have been transformed by them, and you are living evidence of the influence that these ideas have had in the West. I mean, it would have been inconceivable in the early part of the 20th century for you to be doing what you're doing and to be teaching yoga to so many people, yoga in church halls. I mean, I know you're not
even
teaching
in my
in
time,
church.
that was somewhat a problem in the early days. I think less so now, but it was an issue in the
But there
in the
you
90s.
go. So I think there has been this incredible transformation in attitudes. It's paved the way for where we are today. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, thanks for making that clear, because I didn't mean to say earlier that it was a put down kind of book of all these teachers and teachings. It was more like just a kind of very rounded kind of overview, or without any partisan particularities of their lives and their teaching, which is which is inspiring in many ways, as much as it does paint, I think, all of them, it does paint them with a human hue. As I said, apart from Ramana Maharshi, who I think perhaps because there wasn't so much information about him, didn't have so much humanness in his character presentation.
Yeah. Well, again, I've always tried to sort of, I mean, if there's something sort of ironic or a touch of skepticism about something, then I'm always alive to that. But I had to put it mildly. But I couldn't, and why would I? I didn't feel that about Ramana Maharshi at all, really.
He doesn't have another side to him, does it? But I mean,
no. But I do feel that about Osho as.
Let's get on to Osho, because he's obviously an easy way to conclude. I mean, that is what at the end of the book I would call a romp, because it can be no other way with Osho and his ashram, really. I mean, unbelievable the way. I mean, obviously people might have seen Wild Country. Fantastic documentary. was
Brilliant.
good. And you kind of go over some of the similar grounds, but unbelievable the kind of things that you describe. Yeah. So just give us a little overview of Osho, and because again, starts out in very, very reasonable way.
I mean, he was a philosophy teacher at an Indian university, and then begins to sort of gather a following around him. I mean, he's a great iconoclast. I mean, he's someone that sort of attacked. Show him a sacred cow, and in every sense of the word, and he'd attack it. He attacked Christianity, he attacked Mother Teresa, he attacked anything basically. And if you boil it down, his philosophy was basically be free. Free yourself of conditioning, free yourself from constrictions. Free yourself from ideas of morality, free yourself from ideas of convention, free yourself from ideas of marriage, for example. And I think one can't underestimate, I mean, he did teach free love, and I think one can't underestimate the appeal that had to many people at that time who were people of the kind of the hippie generation. And people began to flock to him in India, first of all. And very interesting, the people that did come to him. I mean, they weren't just sort of itinerant, indigent hippies, who'd been sort of begging on street corners in Delhi. I mean, these were psychiatrists, philosophers. He was clearly a brilliant teacher, and he drew on all sorts of strands. He drew on Buddhism, he drew on Jainism. He was a fascinating character. So first of all, he has this ashram in Pune, and then he runs afoul of the Indian authorities over matters of taxation. So we begin to see the signs of, the way that he's rubbing up against the establishment, and they don't like him. So he decamps to America and founded this extraordinary town, basically, in Oregon, Rajneeshpuram. And people flocked to that. I mean, people came from all over the world. And it was an extraordinary utopian community.
How many people were in it at its height?
I think there was something like 6,000-7,000 people living there permanently, but then, many, many more people would come as visitors. So it had its own landing strip. It had its own sewage plant. And this was established in the middle of nowhere, basically. But, it was made habitable, had its own food supply. But then the whole thing starts getting out of hand. It's not enough just to have this sort of utopian community. There becomes a very messianic streak about it. And you could say arguably driven by the people around him as much as by he himself. And they then take over the local town of Antelope, much to the chagrin of the local people who live there. So they begin to make enemies as much as they're making friends. And then, of course, that ball then begins to roll. So they begin to arm themselves because they believe that they're going to be, it all goes a bit David Koresh, that they think it's going to go that way. And it becomes very...
Poison the town. Try and rig elections and
exactly all of that standard the path,
standard procedure,
the path to enlightenment. Let's poison everybody around us. And of course the ultimate sort of eccentricity for which he's probably best known is the 90 or so Rolls Royces that he had, not to mention the endless number of expensive wristwatches. And the Rolls Royces are very interesting because the standard sort of riposte to that would be disciples would give him the Rolls Royces, and it was a sign of how meaningless these material things were. That this surplus is sort of, well, how absurd is that? It's almost like a cosmic joke. But I spoke to somebody talking with somebody who'd been in the ashram for a long, long time, and she said, well, it wasn't quite like that. He'd actually love to sit there looking through car catalogues, saying, I quite like that model if I could. And so, these cars were being sort of ordered at his request, and there'd be these absurd processions where he'd be driven around in procession in his Rolls Royces with people singing and dancing and chanting. So I think it's the furthest extreme you can get from the ascetic sitting under the Bodhi tree, or the ascetic sitting in a Himalayan retreat, or the ascetic sitting in his ashram with a handful of followers around him, imparting wisdom and holiness. And the other thing that's interesting to me, and I think is so indicative of what that organization became, is that he became infamous as Rajneesh. He eventually had to flee America, taking his extraordinary collection of wristwatches with him. Had to leave the Rolls Royces behind, sadly. But he was prohibited from landing in all sorts of countries in the world. But eventually ends up back in India, and promptly changes his name. So the bad old Bhagwan Rajneesh is sort of airbrushed from history, and he becomes Osho. And I think I'm right in saying if you now look at the website for Osho and all the literature for Osho, there's not a lot of mention of Rajneesh and Rajneesh Param and armed guards and poisoning the local population. And so I think there's something a little bit, I'll be chastised for this, but I think there's something a little bit dishonest going on there. But clearly he was an extraordinary man, and again, some people perhaps, certainly some people gained an enormous amount from his teachings and from listening to him.
And the books were good, and as you say, the synthesis of wisdom and crossover, and the way that he managed to link in different religions together, and the iconoclastic aspect for people like us that maybe like a little bit of that. Wonderful books, but something slightly dishonest. Sitting in his house on laughing gas and God knows what other drugs, and arms running and all the kind of things that he was getting up to in that we read in your book. For sure.
So I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't know how we reconcile all these paradoxes. But I mean, paradox is a word again that describes so many of these characters that one encounters. It's the same. I mean, the thing that undermines, I think, so many spiritual teachers coming to the West are the obvious sort of human appetites, about power and sex. And going back to the conversation we had a little earlier on before we started recording this about Shangri-La syndrome, and the sort of the idealized picture that people have. In Tibetan Buddhism, and that's not been immune to sexual scandal.
Not at all.
I mean, there was the infamous Sogyal Rinpoche, exactly, and teachers in America. So,
how do you think it went differently between because again, another interesting parallel was the US and the UK, two fundamental touchdowns of Eastern wisdom coming over. Do you see parallels, or distinct rivers, or was the wisdom taken up in a different way? Could you say anything about that at all?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think America was, I don't want to say more lucrative sort of landing ground for Eastern teachers, but certainly I think there were more. It took a firmer foothold in America than it did here in the States than it did here, and because America's bigger, of course. We haven't discussed the boy god Guru Maharaj Ji, who I touch on in the book, who was the 12-year-old boy who came to Britain in the 1970s, and had quite a significant following here. Spoke at the Glastonbury Festival. Apparently, talked to Michael Eavis about this, the guy who runs the Glastonbury Festival. He said he had a telephone call from someone saying, God's landed in England, can we put him on the stage? He said, oh, sure, bring him down, put him on. And so the Guru Maharaji appeared at Glastonbury. This is before it was quite the sort of corporate behemoth that it is now. Didn't go down too well. He said, now is the time to be doing away with sects, SECTS. And most people heard this as now is the time to be doing away with sex, SEX. And so I think he was roundly booed with that sentiment. But he then went to America, and his followers rented the Houston Astrodome. for one of his for this great sort of convocation, and the Husanestrom is a pretty big venue. But they weren't able to fill it, and there were all sorts of speculative stories, very much stories of the day, that it would levitate at the time that he was speaking there, in the same way as the Pentagon was one day supposed to have been levitating. And he followed actually very much the path that the Maharishi Mahesh followed, that gradually the stripping away of the Eastern trappings, the white dhoti went, the garlands of marigolds went, the business suit was put on rather than that. And rather than being a sort of spiritual teaching, it was then presented as a sort of a more fluffy, follow this practice and it will maximize your efficiency and maximize your capacity to deal with, much more a sort of therapeutic kind of exercise than a spiritual exercise.
Yeah. I've got to touch on the Maharishi. That was a great chapter. I mean, obviously the guru of TM, Transcendental Meditation, and perhaps the most famous figure really, in fact, because of the Beatles, because the Beatles became interested in the Maharishi and they went over and then they got slightly disillusioned, didn't they, and left under a bit of a black cloud.
Yeah, they did. Well, he came to England and gave a talk at the Hilton Hotel, and Patty Boyd, who was George Harrison's wife at that time, girlfriend.
I was always a bit uncertain about that.
Yeah, I should know that for sure. Anyway, she was very interested in that, and she suggested to the Beatles that they should come, and so they dutifully turned up at the Hilton and then met him. And then there was this. He was giving a sort of a retreat in Bangor in Wales. And they went down there with Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull and a couple of other sort of pop figures of the day. And it was there that they heard the news that Brian Epstein, their manager, had died. So that episode was rather scarred by that. But subsequently, they did the following year. They went out to Rishikesh and spent some time at the Maharishi's ashram in Rishikesh. And I think George Harrison of all of them, took to that with the greatest ardor, as did Mike Love of the Beach Boys. A couple of the Beach Boys became quite serious devotees of the Maharishi. Lennon much less so. And there were rumours at the time that they were there. Mia Farrow was there, and Mia Farrow's sister was there. And there were stories that the Maharishi had tried to sort of put the make on Mia Farrow's sister. And again, there's something just parenthetically about this, is that the Maharishi was very aware of how important the Beatles were. And they weren't treated. There were a number of Western visitors there at that time. There were TM teachers, in fact, who were there. But the Beatles were given preference, and they were given the front row in every talk that the Maharishi gave. And and he was very canny. He could see how advantageous it was to him and his teachings to have the Beatles as apostles for him. And in fact, the Beach Boys did a tour in America, where they had the Maharishi as their opening act. And so he would come on before the show and give a talk and giggle and look rather lovely. But that finished, he only played 2 or 3 dates. And it soon became apparent that that wasn't going to work. And that the audience wanted to hear sort of fun, not the Maharishi.
Surfing safari.
Yeah, not surfing safari.
So just... really, everyone in the audience listening, please get the book, because it really is a fun read, and as Mick said at the start, not at all a difficult read. So in this current day and age where we've got so much to process, it's easy recreation. It's not a taxing read, but it's a fun and very insightful read, because it does show, as I've been suggesting all along, the kind of layers that we're building on these days that we haven't come across where we're at now, apropos of nothing, afresh, that we really are kind of building on all this rich tapestry of the East meeting the West and the different syntheses that are being made. So I suppose to wrap up, Mick, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Well, who was your favourite? Who would you if there was one guru, who would you take?
Well, I mean, I think Ramana Maharshi is the most admirable of them. Yeah. To be frank, I'm not really a kind of guru follower.
No, I think that comes across. You're a journalist, so there's
yeah,
a healthy amount of skepticism.
That explains a multitude of sins, does it?
Exactly.
That's my get out, of course. But I mean, I don't really talk about him at all in the book. But if there was one religious, spiritual teacher that I've met who has left the deepest impression on me, it's unquestionably the Dalai Lama.
Right.
Can I tell you very quickly a story about the Dalai Lama, which tells you why I think he's extraordinary? So I was writing another book about a Tibetan Lama called the Karmapa, which was also basically about the politics of reincarnation, and the Dalai Lama played quite a significant part in this. So I managed to arrange a meeting with the Dalai Lama in India, and went out there to meet him. And before going, a friend of mine who is a Danish woman who is a Tibetan Buddhist nun had asked me to take a letter, I think to do with her mother, which she wanted me to give to the Dalai Lama. And I had 45 minutes with the Dalai Lama, and his secretary behind was agitating that, you really must bring the meeting to a close. And 10 minutes later, finally, that happened. And as I was leaving, I suddenly remembered happily that I had this letter that I was supposed to give him. And so I gave him the letter, and he said, "What is this?" And I explained about the Tibetan Buddhist nun in Denmark, and I think it's about her mother. I fully expected him just to pass it to his secretary behind him, but he didn't do that. He opened the envelope, took out the letter, and he read the letter. And inside the envelope was a picture of the nun's mother. And he took out this picture and he held it in the palm of his hand. And I tell you, Adam, it was as if time stopped. I mean, he just looked at this picture of this woman, and it seemed as if he was pouring compassion into this picture. Took the photograph and the letter, put it back in the envelope, and I thought, now he gives it to the secretary. He tucked it inside his robe next to his heart. That was the end of the meeting. And 2 days later, this is before the age of mobile phones, 2 days later, I went to the cyber cafe, and there was an email from my friend, the nun in Denmark, saying that she had received an email from the secretary to the Dalai Lama, saying Mick Brown had given His Holiness your letter, and His Holiness wants you to know that your mother is in His Holiness's prayers. And I just thought that was, I mean, he's an extraordinary person to meet and spend time with and to talk to. And if anybody does radiate a sense of sort of something about him. But that just affirmed to me what an extraordinary, the only thing that mattered to him in that moment wasn't the next appointment that he was probably running late for. The only thing that mattered to him was that woman and dying woman, and being with her in the only way that he could be with her. And it was just extraordinary.
Probably a nice way to wrap up the interview as a kind of positive affirmation of the highs of the person can reach to. And because I think that some of our discussions have shown the let's say some of the pitfalls of the possible guru, but it's also nice to celebrate the possibilities that we have to as a human nature, isn't it? I suppose a little bit of levity to end up. In England, we go for a drink sometimes, or have a pint, go down to the pub. Who would be your companion if you were to have a drink with someone and you could bring them back from the past? Go out and have a chat with them.
Well, come on. I'm sure the same as you. I'd quite like to have a drink with Aleister Crowley if he was around.
Probably Crowley, wouldn't it? Yeah. Maybe Crowley. Bring Crowley and Osho together. That would be a good...
That would be... that'd be an interesting dinner party.
Good night. Yeah.
It really would be. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Well, I appreciate very much you taking the time, Mick, to come on and chat about your book. Again, I'd say the best thing to do is read the thing. We've done as much justice as we can to it, but there's a lot more to it. I mean, it's incredibly well researched, as I mentioned, and it just really goes to show that there's been a long tradition of East meets West, and it's really, really interesting. So, thanks again, Mick, for coming on.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind words. It's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
We'll put the link in the show notes to the book. Thank you.